Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started here in just a second. We let our participants enter the room. Welcome, everybody. Feel free to say hello in the chat while we get kicked off here. We'd love to know who's in the room with us. Give us your name and your geographic location, military affiliation. We love to know who we're talking to. And we're really excited to welcome you here today. Happy month of the military child. Our military kids are just so incredible for their resilience and for all of the love and support that they give. And they serve too, along with their parents. We are here today to explore some additional challenges for unique populations of our military connected children. And on behalf of the Combined Arms Family Committee, it is my privilege to welcome you here today. My name is Kelly Finstormer. I'm the Executive Director of the Combined Arms Institute, and we ensure that all of our organizations that we partner with are working together and collaborating on behalf of veterans and military families. As Combined Arms was formed to really focus intentionally on the veteran, over the past several years, we've been making some really intentional efforts to know that the military family has plenty of resources and just as many challenges navigating those resources. And so we've been making some really intentional efforts to create partnerships with the family organizations that support active duty, Guard, Reserve, caregivers, veteran families as well, to ensure that we help with those life transitions, as we know that all of you go through every day. I want to kick this off. I started earlier this week with an amazing event hosted by the National Military Family Association. As we get started, they did some research on military teens, and I thought it would be great to share and level set based off of some of that information before we kick into these exceptional populations of military children and understanding their voices. What they did was research on about 2,000 military teens across the globe, and they were able to share what's bothering military teenagers. And they shared that it's hard enough as a teen, but those experiences are exacerbated, especially when moving overseas, when parents are deployed, when deployments come out of left field, and when they have to shoulder the responsibilities as hidden helpers. Our military teens and children are acting as caregivers too. NMFA, the NMFA shared their research that 63% of military teens reported that they had a moderate well-being, which is pretty good, but only 9% of those teenagers reported that their well-being was high. 25% of military teens sought out mental health care, and 1 in 10 children did not ask for help because they didn't connect with their parents and connect into that care. The good news is our military teens, 44% of them plan to serve in the military in the future. These people are going to continue the family business, and they are our future. And so it's really important that we take care of our military children. We had the pleasure of hearing from the Secretary of Education, Honorable Miguel Cardona, and he thanked every teenager in the room, saying, "You serve too." And we understand that these kids represent the future of our armed forces, but they also represent all military connected children today. And within each of those children, there are subpopulations that have their own unique needs, unique challenges, and we have all unique families. And so we wanted to draw your attention to some of those populations and highlight those conversations for you today. And so I'm incredibly grateful and honored to introduce to you our amazing panel today, who's going to be facilitated in partnership with Kelsey Liverpool from Kids Rank, who is one of our amazing family committee chairs. She's going to help facilitate this conversation today. But we have people, and I'm going to introduce our panelists for you so that way we can jump right into the content, or from organizations representing these exceptional military kids. First, I'm going to start out with Sean Diesen. So Chief Diesen is a military service member, husband, and father of 2 kids. Sean joined the Navy in 2008 and has been stationed at 6 different commands and completed 2 shipboard deployments, a tour in Djibouti, Africa, and an operational mobilization supporting special operations. He became a father in 2009 and again in 2016. His wife, Ashley, assumed the role of sole physical caregiver during each of his deployments. Even when stationed at shore commands, rigorous duty assignments have presented unique challenges to their everyday lifestyle. This family has relocated 8 times, changed schools 5 times, and bid farewell to many hometown friends and family. The Diesen family accredits positive perspective, humbleness, and a natural bond with one another for their ability to adapt to these recurring changes. Sean currently serves as recruit division commander and will soon be transferring to the USS Thomas Hudner in Mayport, Florida. Chief Diesen, thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing a bit more about your experiences. Also with us today is Megan Considine. She's the development director for Partners in Promise. Partners in Promise is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to elevating the voices of military families with children in special education. Megan is also an Army veteran, active duty Army spouse, and mother of 2. Her youngest child was diagnosed with autism at age 4. As a highly mobile family, they've experienced firsthand the challenges of transferring an IEP to a new school. In addition to her Army service, Megan has worked in the private sector as a business development operations manager and proposal manager. She has a Master of Public Policy from Oregon State University with a concentration in social policy and Bachelor of Arts from the University of Notre Dame. Thank you, Megan, for joining us and for sharing your experiences with us today. Next, we have Shaina Purser, who's an impassioned advocate with a strong commitment to serving military communities. Her personal experiences as a military family member and caregiver inspired her to become a champion for the community, and champion she is. Shaina earned her Master's of Social Work from the University of Southern California, specializing in macro level interventions, and she serves as the marketing and outreach specialist for PsychArmor, where she promotes systems level change through community outreach, community building, and education. And Shaina is also our amazing wellness chair at Combined Arms. We're so grateful for you, Shaina. Finally, Birdie is a military spouse who also grew up in a military family and has been advocating for LGBTQ military kids for the last 12 years. Currently, she works for Modern Military Association of America, the nation's largest military and veteran nonprofit, as the program coordinator for Mil Pride, focusing on LGBTQ dependents. We're so grateful to all of you. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to help facilitate our conversation today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. Kids Rank, the organization that I run, we work specifically with military and veteran children. So Month of the Military Child is our month. And so I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation and really explore, even within our program, the varying, populations that we serve within military culture. And so I want to start out by letting our panelists each explain a little bit about how they were brought into this conversation, really kind of sharing a little bit about the unique populations of military connected kids that they see or they experience. So why don't we start? Let's start with Shaina. I'm going around in my view.
First, pick on me first. No, thank you. I appreciate that. So I enter the conversation, to bring some awareness around, children that are experiencing separation, children who experience separation, be it from the military, be it through divorce. Children see this in a lens of loss. And so that's something that heavily impacts them and can be compounded by some of the stressors associated with military life. Something that I really, appreciate and love about this panel today is that I think it really does a great job at representing the intersectionality of the various pieces of the military life and how many different experiences there may be. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to consider the cultural humility in that we can get as competent as we want, but there's also additional factors that we can integrate into how we approach these populations. So that is why I'm here, and I'm just so enthused to be here and appreciate the opportunity to join.
Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that people always think about, they think of the military family, but we have a lot of blended families. We have a lot of single parents. We have a lot of, all within our ranks. And so it is important to talk about what that means and how that works within our community. I'm going to jump to, thank you, Shaina, to Megan.
Shaina, I loved the term cultural competency that you just used. It was just a really great term. And so it really stands out, or cultural humility, actually. And that stands out with what we try to do with Partners in Promise. And we elevate the stories of our families who have children in special education. This is a wide range of children. No two are alike. Regardless of their diagnosis. If you've spoken to one child on the spectrum, you've spoken to only one child on the spectrum. It can be ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, disabilities, medically complex children, children who need additional resources at their school, in their school setting, to receive the supports that they need to be their best selves. So we're here to elevate their stories and help families get the resources that they need and be advocates for their own children until their children can hopefully one day advocate for themselves as well. And in the military community, when we move every couple of years, it's especially important to make sure our families are informed and that the wider community is informed of these challenges that our children face.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, you figure that there are military kiddos in every single zip code. And so it's more important than ever for people that are our civilian friends and that work with our families, that they be educated. So that's a really important point. So thank you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Chief Diesen.
Well, hey everyone, and I'm so thrilled that you finished with talking about permanent change of station and changing every 2 or 3 years. If I was to unblur the background, you would see an empty room behind me as my family is preparing to change duty assignments down to Mayport. If I can share just a quick little anecdotal thing that a senior chief once told me. Not necessarily about children, but in large, we use the term resiliency a lot, and there's a clinical term for that, but often whenever we associate it, I like to think about Jell-O. Jell-O is resilient until you apply a little bit of pressure, you put a little work into it, and then the next thing you know, that resiliency factor kind of goes to the wayside. So I like to consider military children being tough. Tough is like a step beyond. When we step away from the clinical term of resiliency, I like to think that there's like that added layer for our kids. I think my purpose here today is I'm going to give a little bit of perspective and insight as we go along, and I'll chime in on my experiences with my family, my assignments, and how we make the best of every possible situation. I'm very fortunate to be serving in the Navy, and I try to treat each and every day like I owe just a little bit more because I'm very fortunate. My family is very well taken care of. We're constantly moving around, but there's definitely a benefit to it. And I like referring to my children as my little best friends. They're the exact same person. I'm the exact same person I am with you that I am with them. And we've seen a lot of growth in our relationships as a part of it. So I'll chime in, I think, as we go along and give you a little bit of, how I've operated through, how my children have operated through, and how we were able to create those bonds.
Thank you, Sean. Being an RDC, which is what Sean is, that being an arduous duty, we were talking about it earlier today, that it's you think about these billets and maybe only having service members that are deployed in an Iraq or Afghanistan is what people kind of think about when deployment, but Navy has different deployment cycles. And then this being an RDC is an arduous duty. So the time commitment, trainings, all of those things are outside of the scope of what I think a lot of civilians might consider when it comes to the family structure. And so, Sean can speak to that more, but I think it's really an important piece of that unique perspective in being a part of our families.
You're absolutely right. And if you if you ask your everyday sailor maybe what the tougher parts are, it's not really the deployment. When you go on deployment, you get to just focus on the job. It's those workup cycles, or when you are considered shoreside. As a recruit division commander at boot camp, if there are recruits awake, that means I'm there. That takes you out of the house for an extended period of time. And, there could be some stresses there, but there's easy and outstanding ways of incorporating your personal life with your professional life, and ensuring all those bonds stay nice and strong and so forth. But your everyday sailor is going to say, those lead ups to the workups, to the deployments, those are substantially more difficult because I'm balancing all of those personal roles and the professional roles. When I get out to sea, I get to just be chief, and I'll make the occasional phone call home to make sure everything's okay, but I'm not having to wear each and every hat simultaneously each and every day.
Yeah, and I forget sometimes when we talk in acronyms, RDC is a recruit division commander, and that for Navy, work at Recruit Training Command, the only boot camp for the Navy, and so a recruit division commander and RDC boot camp instructor. So, all right, thanks, Sean.
Sure.
Catherine.
Hi, thanks for having me here today. When we think about military kids, I think we automatically go to moves and deployments and changing schools. And I just want you to think for a minute how much more complicated that might be if your child was LGBTQ and all the complications that arise therein. Say you're trans, and every time you move, do you have to come out to an entire new population? What are the laws in that state going to be? Is your child going to be able to access medical care? Will they be able to be on sports teams? And families are faced with those decisions all the time. We are a very small segment of the population, how only 7 to 9% of youth identify as LGBTQ, but within the military, if you think about 1.2 million military youth, that's about 100,000 kids. So it is a significant number in that sense that, has some more challenges than maybe the typical military family. And we just want to spotlight those and their needs.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that most people think about that necessarily. And, I did know, I learned last year that military is the largest employer for the LGBTQ, percentage wise population. And, but, you don't always think about the children that are, in part of that population.
Right. And I would just add, when that National Military Family Association study that was mentioned earlier talked about around 40% of kids plan to also serve, LGBTQ kids also would be a part of those numbers, but often they find roadblocks when they are trying to also go into the service. And then when another aspect of that study was 28% of military kids rated their mental health as low or poor. When you focus on just LGBTQ kids, that number went to 70%. So there's definitely some things lacking for military kids in that sense. And the best things we can do is get them the healthcare they need and access to EFMP support and things like that.
Well, and I'll just jump in here for a second too. I want to just reiterate that our LGBTQ community serves at a greater percentage than they are represented among the American population specifically. And so it's an amazing service-oriented group of people that identify that way. And that's why it's even more critically important that we understand and figure out how to help this community both navigate what life is like before service, during service, and after service.
Yeah. I mean, and so we had some great questions submitted before the session, and I think that maybe at this time we might dive into some of them just to kind of continue the conversation and get things rolling. And I think since this is where, we left off, we can kind of go back, around. And since you, Catherine, had already started talking, are there any current DOD or other federal legislation that addresses the needs of this population?
Yes. So I would back up and say that currently there's 240 anti-LGBTQ laws being proposed in the various states. And those would not be so much of an issue if we had the Transgender Dependent Act passed. That was proposed several years ago and has just kind of been sitting in committee. And we would love if that got more attention. And then we wouldn't need that if we could get the Equality Act. And that would certainly codify transgender service so that they couldn't find out in another administration that they don't have their jobs anymore. So we would love that. The Transgender Dependent Act and the Equality Act would really help codify transgender service.
Okay. I know for you, Megan, I believe, were there any legislative pieces around special needs and education that you wanted to talk about?
Sure. So IDEA, and I think someone may have mentioned it in the Zoom chat, but IDEA is a federal law that is in place to protect children with special needs or who are eligible for special education services in their school. What we find is that from state to state, it's implemented a little bit differently. So it's really important that both installation commanders, school communities, military families are aware of how this impacts families as they move from state to state. Last year, it was added to the NDAA to provide legal support to military families through installation. So every service branch is implementing that differently, but families now have access to legal support if they're in a position with a school district where they feel they need another person to look at their child's IEP to make sure they're receiving services. So that's a great benefit for military families that is still being in the process of being implemented. And then there's also the MIC-3, which is the Military Interstate Children's Compact Commission. It's not a law, it's a regulation, but states do have signed on to it, and it is supposed to make it easier for parents and military families to move from state to state.
Yeah, that's true. We've been talking about, I know MSEC does a lot of work around, ensuring the support of that, as well as, training for educators, which is so important. Yeah, a few people have talked about training our civilian communities, and, which is a really big piece of all of this conversation. Did anybody else want to chime in on legislation before I move on?
Would, if possible. And one of the things that is really near and dear to my heart, and why I appreciate organizations such as all the organizations here, but Partners in Promise, your work with children with exceptional needs. I have a daughter with autism myself. And as a veteran family, the rules are a little bit different for us, but as far as legislative priorities with regard to the care and access to care for our children with special needs, there are unfortunately some barriers in access to services, that are presently in place. And we were very excited, this most recent NDAA to be able to pass some legislation to have a study done by the national academies to look into these resources or these policies that may be impeding access to healthcare relevant to these special needs. And, and that's a big passion of mine personally, as a social worker, but also as a parent to a child with special needs. So I love adding that consideration on the healthcare perspective, because it's not immune to the to the policies and legislations that affect healthcare accessibility and mental health care that we know is a big issue within these communities.
Right. I'll just add to that, Shaina. That stability and continuity of care is especially important in these communities, both Catherine's community and Shaina's community, these exceptional children, and there need to be guardrails in place to provide those supports and make sure that they're there for our military children.
Great. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's great. We're seeing some resources here in the chat. And so we will look to together also something that we'll send out at the end to provide some more resources we'll talk about towards the end. But I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about, kind of the family structure and, in terms of how there was a question that came from one of our guests or participants. Is it possible to form a secure attachment with a child despite being frequently absent? And I thought that Sean would be able to give some good insight to that, being as though he's the service member and knowing how close his relationship is with his children, how he's been able to manage that.
Oof. Well, it's unique to say the least, but I wouldn't change it for anything. So I'm a father of a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old. And like I mentioned earlier, they're both my little best friends. I think my relationship with my children, I'm very fortunate to have a very strong relationship with my wife. And so it starts from there. But I've treated my daughter as if she was, special to me since day one. And as a result, we've been able to really blossom in our relationship and be able to see eye to eye in a lot of different areas. So communication was probably one of the biggest factors. I saw someone come through in the chat that was from United Through Reading, and that was one of the very first things that I ever did as a super junior sailor. I did a United Through Reading to my unborn daughter at the time. I was establishing my own mental connection to the idea of fatherhood while at sea, while learning my trade, while kind of being far away but still being connected. And this was a time period where when you pulled into port, there wasn't ready access to the internet, and so you had to go shop around to try and find a computer somewhere so that maybe you could catch a Skype phone call and see your pregnant wife or whatever it might be. So we started there, and I think we've had the largest success is I'm the same person I am in uniform that I happen to be out of uniform. And so I've merged my two lifestyles. I didn't try to keep Sean in one cup and Chief Diesen in another. Even here at Recruit Training Command, I leveraged the command and what the individual allowances happen to be able to incorporate my family in what I do. And through that, I was able to establish some buy-in. So my family completely committed to me, committed to what makes me happy, what brings joy to me, and they're on board with the sacrifice. So if I had an opportunity to bring them on board so that we could have lunch together, we took it. My wife is heavily active in volunteerism, and she did some volunteering on the base. We of course did all the typical MWR, that's another acronym, events on board and whatnot. But I would say my biggest success at keeping strong bonds, even while serving abroad, is communication and incorporation. They are just as much invested in my Navy career as I happen to be. And if you know anything about being a chief in the Navy, we go through a little initiation process. And I promise you, while I was going through that transition, the little 6-week process we have, my daughter was going through that same stuff. So even though I had that and I was local, my time was very taxed, but I had a lot I had to do and a lot I had to learn. So instead of trying to just keep those two things separate, I had my own little study buddy right there with me. And so I always like to joke and say my daughter was prepared to become a chief back when she was 6 years old. I might have digressed a little bit there and gotten slightly off topic, but I think that drives it home.
No, that's it's really nice to hear, kind of personal experiences and stories of, like a glimpse into our lives, because I think that is, is an important piece of it to
Absolutely.
understand. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to share, from your side? Like, I know from my side, being a spouse, like being, Sean, you need to mute. From being on my side, the when a service, when my service member went away, and and how we had ways of trying to make sure that the children feel still attached, and secure, and felt, that they were safe and protected during that time. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to add before I move forward.
If I may, and I think it takes from, this family system approach of, making sure that the child is, properly supported and empowered, is also largely connected to the success of their primary caregiver during this time. So making sure that these primary caregivers are, informed and have supports available to them so that they can model this behavior. This is going to have the biggest effect on the child, but also on how they handle, connecting and maintaining that connection with their child. And like, others have illustrated, there are some incredible opportunities to connect. And one of the ones that we used in our family were those dolls that would either look like your service member, or you could throw that little image into the face portion. And my daughter still, we're no longer active duty. She still loves that. And that was able to help her a lot during that process.
Yeah. And and I think also Shaina, I'm sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
No, I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to add one final point. Some of the stats that I shared can seem really, really dark and depressing when it comes to LGBTQ youth. But the most important thing and the really good news is that it just takes one adult, one affirming or accepting adult to turn around mental health. We see like a 40% improvement in mental health outlooks with just one affirming or accepting adult. So, and that can be you. So that's the good news.
That's amazing. I didn't know that statistic. I'm going to have to write that down. No, that's really fantastic. I think it's why it's great to have these kinds of conversations, because some people think it like takes these big gestures and but I think it's about just having a child,
no, it doesn't at all. Just showing that one
seen.
kid your love
Right.
and support. Yep.
Yeah, that's really wonderful.
Yeah. And I want to add something too. When we're talking about neurodiverse kids, it is that connection may look a little bit different, or it may take a little bit longer. So I would just encourage parents not to get too frustrated, especially if you're the deployed parent who's away and you feel like you're not making that connection. You can try different ways of connecting. You just heard two different ways that families connect, but there are other ways you can approach it. You can work with your provider to talk about other ways to connect with your child, because not every child connects in the same way, especially if they're neurodivergent.
No, this goes back to the whole purpose of this, the uniqueness of our military children, and that each one is different. It's the approach that we take, kind of in our programming, is that we want to get to know each child, because each one has something special and amazing to bring. And, not everything is going to work for every child the same way. And so, no, this is really wonderful. Thank you all for sharing. I am going to now, Megan, let me ask you, one of the questions we got is, how can the military community, DoD and non-disability focused nonprofits support military students in special education?
So the first is what's already starting to be done is to talk about them, to talk about what's not working. It's okay to talk about where there are problems, because if you don't, you're never going to fix them, or you're never going to get the funding to fix them. So if IDEA is not working in some states or school districts, elevating concerns is a way to advocate for our children and hopefully get them the support that they need. So the first is share those stories. The second is provide training, provide advocacy training, connect families to resources. There are parent resource centers in every state. There are training programs through different nonprofits like MSEC. I've seen them do some training. I've seen training through NMFA. We offer resources from Partners in Promise through our website that parents can look at on their own pace. I'll share that later. And EFMP offices, not the EFMP office that you enroll with, But the EFMP office, it's different with every branch. It could be Fleet and Family Services with the Navy. It can be ACS with the Army. Those coordinators or systems navigators, many of them are starting to get trained to be advocates for families who have children in special education. And sometimes they can sit in on your IEP meetings to provide you with some feedback. And it makes a big difference when you have an outside person in that meeting with you, because sometimes you can get emotional or those meetings can be incredibly overwhelming. So having that additional support is there. It's not perfect, but the system is growing and it's improving, and we're talking about it, which is really the first step.
Megan, if I can just jump in real quick, excuse me, Kelsey, if you could just talk a little bit more and share with everybody about EFMP specifically. So as I know not everybody has the same awareness of it, I think it's a really important component to the work that you're doing.
Sure, thanks, Kelly. And I know Catherine will probably want to weigh in on EFMP as well. One thing about special education is not all children who are receiving special education services are necessarily enrolled in EFMP, nor does the family need to enroll in EFMP. Technically, federally, every location in the United States should provide services in school districts for those families. However, enrolling in the EFMP, if you have a medically complex need for your child, or if your child has a specific diagnosis, means that before you PCS your branch, or however it works within your branch, they're going to look at that location to make sure that the services are in place for your family when you get there. That is how it is supposed to work. And along with that, EFMP provides resources to families through their community centers on installations, support groups, training programs. And you can also reach out to the EFMP office before you move to a location and say, here's my child's IEP, here's our care plan, and they can help set up a plan for you before you get there.
Thank you so much. And you'll see Shaina shared that in the chat as the Exceptional Family Member Program. Catherine, do you want to share a little bit more about that at your lens?
Yeah, for through our lens, EFMP can be really beneficial now in helping trans kids make sure, and LGBTQ kids in general, making sure that they have access to the proper behavioral health care that can really help improve that mental health that we talked about often being a problem. And then we are hoping that in the future, EFMP can do more to help service members in terms of where they are stationed when there are complications between who their child is and the laws of the state. And we're getting a lot of improvement along that. The Air Force recently announced that they were definitely going to be including EFMP when they thought about where for LGBTQ youth, when they thought about where people would be stationed.
That's great. All right.
I may also chime in on this as well. Many folks, including myself, I was not aware that EFMP also plays a role in the healthcare setting as well. In order to access certain medical services through TRICARE, you need to be enrolled in EFMP. So that's a huge consideration for those who also are anticipating a PCS move, being able to coordinate with your EFMP office, as well as ensuring that you are able to identify providers in the area that you are going to so that there's no gap in services as well.
Yeah, that's really important. We were stationed at a recruit training. We were doing recruiting in Pennsylvania, and there wasn't a naval base nearby us. And so when I had my younger daughter, she has a metabolic disorder, and it wasn't until we were PCSing to Japan that I even found out about EFMP. She was 2 by that point, and we had to go through all of these processes, and there was no Partners in Promise at that time. This is almost 20 years ago. And so it would have been really helpful to help navigate that and understand. And it's really great to know that there are these resources now, that EFMP, both on the kind of the medical side as well as the education side, that there are, also EFMP, but also organizations that help you to figure out how to utilize it, because it can sometimes be very complicated.
and It can be, Kelsey, and there is a stigma associated with enrolling in EFMP, but the Navy did the Marines did a study of families who were enrolled in EFMP and whether or not it impacted careers, and it did not. So that is a false narrative that needs to be openly challenged when people say it, and leaders need to be aware of how EFMP works for families so they can share that with families if they have a child or a parent, adult family member who needs to be enrolled.
That's great information to know and to be able to share out. So I am going to now go to Shaina. And another question that we were given was, what are some of the effects of deployment on children?
That is a great question. I think, for so many of us, we can personally, attest to the fact that there are so many ways in which deployment can affect us in so many areas of our lives. And ironically, it wasn't until I actually went into my social work program that I learned about the formal 5 stages within the deployment cycle. So there's actually a cycle in which families need to navigate these changes, both emotionally, family dynamics, financial dynamics. I mean, the dynamics are endless. There's so many ways in which these families need to navigate these changes, not only during the deployment, but also before the deployment. I could give you the names of those, 5 stages, and I'm happy to share with you afterward, just, bearing in mind the time we have. But this is not only, stages as far as, well, step 1, we do this, step 2, we do that, etc. This is an emotional cycle, and it extends beyond the deployment. And it very much affects the child because, as we know, as many of us know, mental health considerations are in relation to deployment for military spouses, those who are left behind to try to juggle everything. And studies have shown that there's a detrimental effect on the mental health of the remaining caregiver. And that modeling behavior and how that caregiver handles the stress has been, research has proven that has an effect on the resiliency and the mental and emotional, effects on the child as well. And so these are additional considerations, as well as we think about, the post 9/11 cohort, this era of war in which we've seen families that are going through multiple deployments, something that was not the case in prior eras. And so what we see is a long history of families having to go through this deployment cycle repeatedly. And when they do that, we're seeing this prolonged and extended, feelings of fear and anxiety, which actually have an effect on, the developmental architecture of that child's mind. And so there's so many factors that go into this deployment cycle. So that's the short piece of it.
Well, I think that's a great, and I just want to also point out that deployment, I think that from a civilian perspective, there is kind of this one view of what deployment looks like. I think that a lot of people think about an Iraq or Afghanistan into war, war-torn areas. But Sean, my sailor, Navy has a very different, experience. Sean, you're going on your sea duty. You're about to go on.
Going back to sea after this tour, but isn't that such a relevant, or I'm sorry, unique term, deployment? So is deployment a physical thing? Is it determined based off of how far away I happen to be from my family at the time, or is it simply just the job? Because I've been fortunate to be in the Great Lakes area here for the last 3 years, but I wouldn't call this a break from a deployment cycle, simply because duty calls. We all stand to watch. We all have jobs to do, and it is important to mentally prepare that even when told that you get to go home each and every single night, there's still an aspect of it that you're not simply just off duty. You're in the Navy 24/7, as they say, and so deployment is a little bit of a fluid term, if you will. We just mostly identify deployment as deploying, but there are often tasks and responsibilities. And response to COVID-19, in fact, we could consider a lot of the troops that responded to that going into some type of a deployment lifestyle in response to whatever area of operations that they happen to be in. But it's not as simply defined as the military parent is going away physically, and that there will be a distance barrier between that caregiver and the child, because sometimes you can be in close proximity and still be gearing up, and especially for sea duty, because you have those workup cycles that take you away for shorter periods of time, but you're still uprooting what most would call a normal 9 to 5 kind of lifestyle.
Yeah, so Shaina, to your point, this kind of workup and the cycle of it all, having these uprootings, and when we lived in Japan as a Navy family, my now ex-husband was gone 8 months out of the year for 3 years straight, and so, but he wasn't deployed in what most people would think of as deployed, because he wasn't in a danger zone necessarily, but
we don't think about training. We don't think about unaccompanied
all the trainings and the separation. And you figure from, we're talking about today from children. And so from the child's perspective, gone is gone, so whether they're
Right.
for the entire family, there is definitely, if you're in an area that there is danger, the level of anxiety is, not knowing what's happening, what's going on, that does have another layer. But in terms of kind of physically being separated, coming in and out of the household, we've moved before and he didn't move with us, and he came back and didn't know where anything was, and roles and responsibilities, and of the children having to shift and to change and stepping into roles of caregiving or this and that because of these separations. I mean, there are a lot of things that go in, and so it the constant shifting and what is talked about in kind of this deployment cycle becomes this ongoing recurring theme within our families.
Children absolutely experience any separation, be it from their parent, be it from the military itself, as a loss. It is a loss no matter what to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned this firsthand the hard way. When my son was in 3rd grade, his teacher called me and said, "Your son is really struggling. We've sent him to the counselor a couple times. He said his dad's deployed." And I said, "No, he's not. He's not deployed." I realized the light bulb came on. He wasn't deployed to me. He was just at a 3-week training exercise. And I realized my 3rd grader doesn't know the difference, or I didn't sit him down long enough to tell him the difference. But regardless to him, his life was disrupted, and
Absolutely.
it had changed, and they saw it at school in his actions.
Yeah.
And I'll share too that another one of the resources that is available specifically on this topic and along many of these topic areas as well is the Sesame Workshop has been an amazing partner to the military community, and they have resources available for families to watch in partnership with their children that can be incredibly helpful to facilitate some of these conversations. And we'll be sure to share all of those resources. There's been some amazing things that are being shared in the chat across the board. So we'll make sure we collate and get that out to everybody. But just wanted to make sure that we highlighted that one specifically. And I know there's another question, and I think it would be interesting for Sean, for you, and perhaps then Shaina, you can kind of follow up with this one, is speaking of our military kids. So then how do we address this? Like, what is it that they want us to know? Like, what should we be asking them or not asking them? And I know, Shaina, you've got a good answer for this one too, so.
Yeah, I would say, that's such a tough question to answer, because I think everything is so very specific to whatever your nucleus is, whatever you happen to call a family. I can only speak from perspective, and clearly not anything from DOD, DON, or the command level. But my own perspective is that the family construct of a United States sailor is probably the most diverse that we'll see in the nation at large. That there is no cookie cutter idea of what the family happens to be. So I think, how do you present, this type of information to a family is vastly unique to whatever your situation happens to be. I consider myself very fortunate to have the daughter that I have, because when things are coming up, she's just included in the conversation, in the decision-making process, almost like a peer or a third person in the conversation. And we've seen that pay out significant dividends in my daughter's positivity and ability to cope and so forth. And she just kind of wrote a little essay about her own perspective on what being a military child happened to be. So we always encourage her to express thought, express creativity, but bring her in the fold. But I don't think that's always that's not going to be the answer for every family, because things are just so vastly different. I think everyone here on the panel, especially talking from different points of view about what that family happens to look like, well, that's how you're going to attack your problem. If there was an answer, I would hope that everybody had it by now, but we just don't.
I have to agree. It's much like, as parents, we wish parenthood came with a manual. There is no child that is the same, and there's no family dynamic that's the same. That's the human condition. Gotta love it. And something that I do feel, especially, we're talking about underrepresented populations, are those populations that have blended families. Very rarely do we, piece in those considerations, because, for one reason or another, we don't consider them to be the norm. I could throw the statistics at you. Maybe I'll do that in an after email, but really what it is also considering, the parent and the family dynamic. There may be divorce, there may be separation, they may be living in two different places due to work or due to where family supports may be. That may limit the availability of information to the co-parent if those are a divorced family. It can also mean that if they are not in the immediate area or located where the service member is, they may not have accessibility to the information that they need during these times. So I can speak as far as my own experience, as a blended family, as a separated family, the dynamic very much changes once there is that division between the parental unit. And so there's decreases in information sharing. And I know we mentioned earlier that information sharing can already be difficult. Having information about the benefits and or coordinating benefits and resources for the child can be an additional consideration. And enhancing and enforcing communication between the child and the service member. There's a myriad of different ways in which these blended family units or these divided families or, just any of these families that may not fit into the cookie cutter or the nuclear family dynamic, as we like to call it, those considerations need to be made, because this is becoming our norm within this community. Military families face a higher rate of divorce than our civilian counterparts, and about 60%. These are the better ones, don't worry. About 60% of our military population, they do have families. So when we consider that we have 60% of this population that has family responsibilities, that we have a higher rate of divorce and separation than the civilian community, and then we also consider post-active military life, there is an increase in divorce rates after active service, as there are less incentives in being married, and also you're facing new stressors that you may not have faced before. So these are all considerations that that I have not seen in these larger conversations, and once again why I appreciate that we're having them, because there is no family that is the same.
Yeah, Sean, you're muted.
You're on mute.
Sometimes I can't unmute myself, other times I mute myself. All right. So I just wanted to share, as we were talking, and especially when you started talking about communication, one thing that came to mind was, as we've established, everybody's a little bit different, but advocacy goes a long way. And I think leveraging those resources that are available, and that we spoke about this briefly, but there's perhaps a little bit of a disconnect about information and resources that are available, and getting that all the way down to the root family. So specifically, service members can get a little too in tune with their job and being successful in their job, and by the time they get to the house, they've kind of forgotten that all of this additional stuff is available. So one of the things, again, anecdotally, that I've done in my life is I love to leverage that kind of resource. So we talked about families moving every 2 or 3 years. Most military families have a hard time feeling connected to the community, and so bringing volunteerism, activism, and even here at Recruit Training Command, we got the military family life counselors on board, specifically designed to talk to spouses and children. And so ensuring that information is getting all the way disseminated back within the household. So if something's coming up, leverage what's being given is such a huge thing. So if we're defining that there is no clear definition on and no clear answer to how do we prepare for these things, I think the best thing that we could do is utilize every avenue to try to keep that level of normalcy at home.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I appreciate that so much. I was actually also trying to throw Shaina a softball question that I clearly did not articulate very clearly, because Psych Armor, in partnership with Camp Corral, created a video about 15 things military and veteran kids want you to know. And I believe one of the first talking points is that not all military kids are the same. So it's, exactly what you all just said, in different formats and different fashions. And so many of your questions and so much of this conversation revolves around the importance of understanding and knowing the resources that are available to you. And we know that our service members, no offense, Sean, but as someone who's been a veteran and military spouse, are not always focused on passing those resources back down to the family unit. But again, that's why Combined Arms has been really intentionally focused on being that resource that can help families navigate to the amazing resources that are available for people. There have been so much that have been shared in the chat, and I just want to highlight a couple of them, as you can access all of those as individuals. Call our intake team if you need somebody to help walk you through that. But of course, Psych Armor has amazing training videos, both for family members as well as organizations, employers, about how to navigate through some of these resources. Our partners at Partners in Promise is a great resource for our exceptional family military program, as well as for those with children with special needs, and helping to just navigate that process. And you'll talk to any single one in that organization, and there's still a long road ahead for our military families. We do not have this figured out. And it's the same, of course, for our LGBTQIA community, and Modern Military Association of America is doing an amazing job at being an advocate and leading the way for these families. And so these are resources that are available to you, and we can connect you all to them via Combined Arms. And of course, Kelsey and our other chair, Hannah Hutler, who's from the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and Kids Rank, are leading the way in terms of family collaboration. So we are just honored to have all of our panelists with us today and to share these resources. Of course, there's so many more. Our great partners at United Through Reading that can connect you to your children, the Sesame Workshop, and the Military Child Education Coalition, and it's just endless. And so that's what we're in the business to do, is help everyone figure out how to navigate this sea of resources to make sure that we are providing that connection and accelerating the connection for our unique populations of military children. We can't all know it all, but having the cultural competency and cultural humility to bring us all together is exactly what we're here to do today. So I thank you all for joining us. I'm so grateful for our panelists, and I just want to thank you all for your time today and having the opportunity to have this conversation. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.